It is my honor to introduce our next guest, Ambassador James Story. Most recently, he served as U.S. Ambassador for the Venezuela Affairs Unit, located at the United States Embassy in Bogota, Colombia. Previously, Ambassador Story served as Charge d'Affaires at the Venezuela Affairs Unit, and prior to mid-2019, the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, Venezuela. Ambassador Story has also served as Consul General in Rio de Janeiro. Other positions include Director of the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs and Senior Civilian Representative in Southeastern Afghanistan. A career Senior Foreign Service Officer, Ambassador Story has served in Sao Paulo, Brasilia, Washington, D.C., Maputo, Guadalajara, and the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. He is the recipient of numerous State Department and interagency awards, including the Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards, the Department of the Army Superior Civilian Service Award, the Warren Christopher Award for Outstanding Achievement in Global Affairs, and the Distinguished Honor Award for the Western Hemisphere Bureau. Ambassador Story grew up in the small town close to where I live of Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and graduated with a BS in Interdisciplinary Studies from South Carolina College at the University of South Carolina. He received an MS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. He speaks Portuguese and Spanish, and we'll do the rest of this in Spanish. Just kidding. Thank you. Welcome, Ambassador Story.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I tell people I'm from Charleston, and then people who know Charleston say, "What part of Charleston?" I say, "Well, Moncks Corner." They're like, "Well, that ain't Charleston, right?" I will attempt to the extent practicable to code switch away from my normal low country brogue that I always put on when I come home, and try to get back into my DC speak. And listen, this is going to be conversational. I'm excited to be here, and I really want to thank Max and everybody at the Mroz Institute for the opportunity to be here, and certainly for a guy from Moncks Corner, South Carolina, to be on stage and with all the other folks, Tony and Dr. Nye and everybody else. It's truly a privilege to have this opportunity. I'm also looking forward. I see some people out here, Sid, I see you and some other folks I know, and encourage you all to think about a career in the Foreign Service, because it's the best career for a person who can't hold a steady job. You get to change every 2 or 3 years, and hopefully we can encourage some of you all to do this. So I wanted to talk about challenges the United States facing right now, and there are a lot of them. I'm kind of narrowing it down a little bit. I designed a course that I'm teaching right now at Georgetown University, called The Rise of the Liberal States in the Americas and Challenges for U.S. Foreign Policy. And I want to talk a little bit about that stuff. I'm in a holding pattern in the hopes of getting another embassy, this time I think in Africa. I think I'm no longer allowed to go to the Western Hemisphere. So I spent a lot of time there. I think they got to get me out. But I want to talk a little bit about the fact that democracy is in retreat. And I want to walk through some of those issues quickly, and then this is going to be conversational, of course, and some of the other crises. And, I feel as if sometimes I discovered fire, and then I realized that Dr. Nye has been talking about this stuff for 30 years, and I'm just now discovering it, right? But if we look at what's happening across the world, about 80% of the world's population lives under free or partly, not free or partly free systems. In other words, they don't live in democracy. 80%. And not one new democracy has been created in the 21st century. And in fact, there's democratic backsliding everywhere. And if you think it doesn't affect you, that there's democratic backsliding in El Salvador or Mexico, or the complete creation of autocracy in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and of course, long-term dictatorship in Cuba, you're not paying attention. And we're going to talk a little bit about another crisis, which is the migration crisis. But our strategic competitors out there in the world have labored to undermine democracy. And frankly, as I look at this backsliding of democratic values and the kind of fraying of the social fabric that allows for democracies to flourish. It's much more than just an election. I wonder whether or not we have all the tools necessary to confront these types of democratic backsliding. So the second thing, I think we talked about it yesterday, globalization ain't going anywhere. We are globally connected. This is this, I think, was mentioned yesterday that you just pick up your phone and you're connected across the world. And I think living in an interconnected world, we have to have a recognition that in order for us to be successful as a country, we have to partner with others. And I think we've done some extraordinary things of late. If anyone understands the relationship between Japan and South Korea and the fact that we now have a tripartite relationship there, the fact that Japan and South Korea could get on the same page, this is big stuff. This is big, important stuff. AUKUS is a big thing. I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was potentially a very big thing, and it was a shame that we backed out of that. But we have to double down on these types of relationships and our international commitments. We can't walk away from them because we can't go it alone. The pandemic taught us about the fragility of the supply chains, and certainly issues such as climate change or internet governance when it comes to AI. These are things that the United States can't do on its own. We have to do it with everybody else. We simply live in a world in which decisions made in one country will affect another. So my third point here is I try to choose my words carefully. I recently gave a presentation at Southcom, Southern Command, and people say the U.S. is in decline, and I'm very clear that we're not necessarily in decline, but what we have is the rise of the rest. We're no longer the same preeminent power that we were. And one of my concerns as a 53-year-old guy from Berkeley County, we'll have a lot of concerns being a 53-year-old guy from Berkeley County, by the way. Y'all should be concerned sitting here listening to me. But in any event, I came of age during a small window of time at the end of the Cold War and before the global war on terror. We had an 11-year period where we were the preeminent military, political, economic, social power on the planet. And we approached our foreign policy from that point of view. We basically could get people to do what we wanted to do and leverage them in ways we wanted to leverage them. And I sometimes find that people that came of age are now the policymakers, myself included. We make bad policy if we approach the policy through that mindset of we're the only game in town, because we're not. You know, for instance, the Iranians send some ships and they dock in Rio, and then the Brazilian government allows them to do that. Well, Brazil's got options. Argentina, Brazil, most of South America, number one trading partner is China, not the United States. They have options. We haven't stopped trading with China. I don't think we're going to be able to convince others to stop trading with China. Now, we need to work within an international framework of rules and regulations and how we deal with each other that has been benefited the United States since the end of World War II. And I have big concerns that some of our policy decisions can undermine that position. If we ever lose the dollar as a reserve currency of the world, we've got a big problem. Now, I don't think that's imminent, but it's certainly one of those things that concerns me. And what I have seen is some of the autocratic nations, this autocracy Inc., some like to call it, are actively undermining those institutions internationally. And we can't just fight them one-on-one. We need to build communities of practice and relationships with others to do that. Just two more points before I shut up and we get to Q&A. The migration crisis. A lot of people have heard of the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. It had a name, right? What we're experiencing today is orders of magnitude larger. 8 million Venezuelans have fled Venezuela. And some of our policy ideas are, oh, if we fix the economy in Venezuela, they won't leave. Wrong. We fix the security, they won't leave. Wrong. It all comes down to liberty. And if you don't have liberty, you will look for it and you will go somewhere else for it. When I say 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, let me put it in perspective. That's as if roughly 60 million Americans leave. Can you imagine? Living in the United States and 60 million Americans get up and leave. Now, I know you all have some states, you're like, yeah, that state could go. I mean, we're good. You know, I know how, and trust me, I have my own thoughts. But this is historic, and it's unsettling. It's destabilizing. We talked a little bit earlier. Jeff talked about the end of the Civil War in Colombia. I was intimately involved with that. They're trying to now provide for a populace, but now they have, after the end of this 52-year civil war with the FARC in Colombia, and now they have an added difficulty of 3 million Venezuelans in the country that are seeking access to healthcare and education and all these types of things. This is destabilizing the entire region. And finally, not to overtake my opening here, I want to talk a little bit about our problems of domestic, our domestic problems in the United States, because they affect things that we do abroad. And I think some of the speakers have already indicated over the course of the 2 days whether or not we're a trusted partner, right? We're getting ready to shut the government down again, right? We're going to have that fight again. That's awesome. Looking forward to not getting paid. We can't get ourselves together when it comes to Ukraine. You know, we've got some big problems, and Moises Naim, a guy that I know and a really interesting fellow, he says the three P's is populism, post-truth, and polarization. And I kind of nug it down even further. I think we have three things have happened in the United States which have fundamentally altered our democracy and have made us, to some extent, more towards the extremes. And to be very clear, I don't have a political party. I was nominated by President Trump. I served for 5 presidents. You know, I can't have a political party. I'm a rabid centrist. That used to exist, right? But there are 3 things in the United States I think have to be rectified. And one is Citizens United. I think that was a very poor decision, just too much money in politics. The second is extreme gerrymandering. Only 8% of House seats are actually kind of in play. It's a big problem. And the final one is social media. Interactive period of time here. Who here knows who AOC is? Congresswoman from New York. Raise your hand. Okay, who knows who Marjorie Taylor Greene is? Right? Why do you know who these humans are? Why do you know them? You should know. When I was in college, I had no idea who the first district of South Carolina member of Congress was. I was just not paying attention. I had no idea who my congressperson was. The fact that we now know who these people are, and they drive towards clicks and likes. And I think what it's done is it's driven us away. As a people, we're centrist. But we now have a system in which those that get rewarded are on the extreme. And those who are in the middle do not get rewarded, which is the reason why the member of Congress in this district, for instance, made some recent decisions which were head scratchers. And then I realized, well, but not getting the clicks and likes that the others are getting, perhaps that's the reason. I don't know, right? But I do think these are things that we have to get back to some regular order. And that includes, we cannot no longer legislate by executive order. When the president comes in, it's executive order, executive order. And if we're not doing legislation, it's too easily undone. So I think we have some issues there. And all what this does is it creates an environment in which we are not seen the same way internationally as we traditionally, historically have been. So I do have my concerns. But let me stop there. Let's have a conversation.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Ambassador Story. I really enjoyed your remarks, and you opened it right up for me. So let's say in a couple of months, you become ambassador to South Africa. And
just to be clear, that's too nice a place for someone like me.
I'm trying to give you good luck here. The government is very worried about the upcoming U.S. elections, and especially in terms of traditional relations, alliances, and generally speaking, stability in the world. What would you say to them?
You know, the United States has we have a historic ability to self-correct. And I never bet against the United States. And I don't think anybody else should either. I remember very well being in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, and there was some glee. And I'm like, you can't kill this economy. Don't you worry about it. We'll be fine. Um, so part of it is going to what some of the speakers have already mentioned about building relationships and strong relationships. The job of a diplomat is to kind of get out there and meet with everybody and build those deep relationships so that when you have a tough conversation, you can have it, right? When you have good news, that's always nice. It's pretty rare, but it's nice to be able to deliver some good news. Um, but it's for those moments when you have the bad moment when you need to be able to sit down and say, listen, this is kind of where we are and where we need to be going together. We're going to have to do what we always do, which is areas in which we disagree with the country, we're going to hive that off a little bit and put that on a slow burn, and then really focus in on where we can have win-win results. And South Africa in particular for me is problematic. You know, there's a group of countries that refuse to call out Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I find it shameful. It's problematic. There are others that refuse to. I'll mention Venezuela is what I'm most intimately familiar with. Hopefully, we're Chatham House. I don't know. Anyway, I can retire. It's okay. You know, you got President Lula in Brazil, who does his Sergeant Schultz impression. If anybody's ever seen Hogan's Heroes, it's an old TV program. The group over here has not seen it, but that's okay. I was like, literally, the president says, "I don't know what's happening. I know nothing of what's happening in Venezuela." And they kicked out the Human Rights Commission of the UN. And if you can't speak out against bad actions, and I have a problem with populism from the right and the left because they both end up in the same exact place. And I think we have to really focus in on civil society, as we talked about earlier, knitting together the framework of societies. And I think there's plenty of work we could do with a lot of countries in that area.
Well, having done so much work on Latin America and in Latin America, I have a question about Latin America. So for nearly 200 years, the United States has been involved in the region, for better or worse, from the Monroe Doctrine to the Roosevelt Corollary, the period of interventionism, the Good Neighbor, Alliance for Progress, the so-called War on Drugs, free trade agreements, you name it. And the United States had at times lost focus, but always returned to Latin America. Now it seems that since 2001, the United States has forgotten to develop policy or strategy on Latin America. And if they have, it has been more reactive than proactive. What do you think it will take after so many years for the United States to re-engage in Latin America?
You never want to let a crisis go to waste. And we have a crisis, the migration crisis. And I think this gives us an opportunity to rethink some of our approaches. I actually don't think the United States has ever focused on Latin America. I think we've attempted to on occasion. Even George Bush, when he was president, said, let's focus on Latin America. And then 9/11 happened, and we didn't focus on Latin America. I was kind of the last person to run Plan Colombia, this war on drugs. You know, I thought what we did there was extraordinary, and we did it on the cheap, which, to put in perspective, the FARC, this kind of ideologically Marxist drug trafficking organization that wanted to take over the government, and they had plenty of complaints. Land tendering is a problem. The wealth inequality is terrible in Colombia. They got plenty of complaints. They were literally on the outskirts of Bogota, and in a very bipartisan way, starting under Clinton, we answered the call. And a lot of people focus on the helicopters and the blowing up drug labs. I did all that. That was fun. You know, ineffective, frankly, or they wouldn't have sued for peace, which they did. But what we really did for about $10 billion, which sounds like a big number, we invested in institution building in Colombia. And you mentioned the Warren Christopher Award I got. I actually got that because I exported that model to Central America using Colombians to teach that institution building. And when I say institution building, it's everything from how do you hire police officers so they're not predatory towards the population? How do judges work? Where's your transparency? Do you have investigative journalists? All the kinds of things that kind of create a democracy, the bedrock. And I think at 10 billion, it was cheap. And if you look at, we've already sent 75 billion to Ukraine. I think that's cheap. I spent a year in Afghanistan. That was not cheap. And I don't think our return on investment is particularly good in that case. And it's not just the money, but it's not just about the money, but as my colleagues who have worked in the State Department and government, you show me what you're interested in by showing me your budget, right? And money does matter. And you have to have focus. You have to have an interagency approach. So I think there's a lot of work we can do in Central America in particular. And I think we need to, personally, I'm a big fan of free trade agreements if they're done correctly. It's out of vogue now. But if you look at USMCA before it was NAFTA, it's been extraordinarily positive for the United States and for those countries. Maybe it's the trade agenda, it's the institution building agenda, and it's the approaching the region as partner rather than, well, here's an answer. It's more, let me help you get where you want to be. I think that's that would be a good way to approach it.
And something you just said made me think of a question. Some people would maybe critique the free trade agreements between the United States and areas of Latin America by saying they're free trade, but not necessarily fair trade. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can critique everything. Let's look at Mexico. They couldn't really compete with American farmers. My family's one of them. My wife's family's one of them. So, 2 million corn producers get out of business. But they created the maquiladora industries that provide car parts to the United States. We probably in the United States need to spend more money on transitioning people who are affected by globalization into new jobs because when they feel like they've been left behind, they become beholden to populist sentiment. And I think we can see that playing out very, very clearly. I think most of our free trade agreements have been very good when it comes to the labor the labor appendices, the environment ones as well. But could we be better? Sure, we could be better. But there's a give and take here. The Biden administration's policy on Latin America is a bumper sticker that we want Latin America to be democratic, middle class, and secure. And we do that by trading more effectively, operating more effectively, and working together as partners.
Thanks. And now to a question specifically about Venezuela. There should be presidential elections in December of this year. In October of 2023, Maria Corina Machado won the primary with an unexpectedly high voter turnout. In January 2024, so last month, the Venezuelan Supreme Court ruled that Maria Corina Machado was not eligible to be a presidential candidate. This marks a long tradition of the Chavez followed by the Maduro regimes changing the rules to avoid political opposition to their regime and laugh in the face of democratic norms. Do you see the current situation as being in any way different?
No, I'm going to go back in the Wayback Machine just a little bit. As I got there in July of 2018, we had to close the embassy in January when we recognized Guaido as the constitutional president of the country. They kicked us out. I sent all the families home. I stayed behind because we didn't recognize Maduro and Guaido told us to stay. So I stayed with the Marines and some diplomatic security people for another 7 weeks under pretty austere circumstances. But I mean, it's nothing compared to Afghanistan, all these other things. It was fine. But eventually we did have to leave, and I could tell that story offline maybe, but uh, dictatorships that have used the mechanisms of state to hide what it is they're doing, or not even hide it so much. I mean, they're doing it. They're using the state against itself. Yeah, I do wonder if we have the tools to be able to actively and uh, i- i- operate against that kind of a setup. Now, we were intimately aware of the primary process. I won't go further than that. We understood what was happening. And I think when we had our maximum pressure campaign, I was a big believer and I remain a believer that the sanctions were a tool, not a strategy, and that we needed to use a leverage as part of a strategy, which was negotiating. Even if negotiating with a dictator has a 10% chance of success, that's better than zero, right? And that's what I told Secretary Blinken. All right, we should give it a go. Um, and what you also want to do in dictatorship is you want to create opportunities for dilemmas and mistakes. And I recall, I think it was just 3 or 4 days before the Berlin Wall came down, the Washington Post had an editorial saying our policy against with the Soviet Union has failed. We need to change tack. The Berlin Wall falls down. So as Martin Luther King Jr. said about the arc of the moral universe, bending towards justice, I believe the problem with autocracies is that they believe their own press. Um, and my job as a diplomat was to create dilemmas. And frankly, Maduro has reacted poorly to every dilemma he has been confronted with. He did not think that the opposition could pull off a primary. They did. He did not think that Maria Corina Machado or any candidate would win such a massive number of votes. It was 94% roughly. She did. Then he did what all these kinds of people do. I think Samuel Johnson said that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. So then he goes, okay, we're Guyana. That belongs to us. Let's do a referendum. Nobody showed up to vote. And I think he realized he doesn't have popular support. So he's going to go to his playbook, which is divide and conquer. And he may do what I call the full Ortega, which is what happened in Nicaragua, just a couple months before the election. They throw everybody in jail. And then of course you win you win an election. I do wonder why we have a free trade agreement with Nicaragua under those circumstances, but seriously, but I'm not, if my boss is seeing this, it's your decision. Uh, you know, um, but I think what we have to do is keep creating dilemmas. I think this should be taken up in the Organization of American States. We have the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I think the United Nations should talk about human rights abuses that are happening there. Although, this is difficult when you have countries such as Iran and Cuba on the Human Rights Commission, or you have Iran at one point in time in charge of women's issues. It's like, okay, well, this is an odd duck. I got it, Um, but I think Venezuela deserves to be back on the agenda, and we need to continue to seek support from some of the ideologically to the left spectrum countries. And here, specifically, I've already mentioned Lula, but Lula, Petro in Colombia, and AMLO in Mexico, they need to recognize that first, Maduro is not ideologically on the left. It's a criminal organization masquerading as a government, and that we need to put the limits to them as well. Everybody should say it's not okay to torture people. It's not okay to take away people's right to vote. It's not okay to not allow people access to government services because of their beliefs. This, I think, is kind of fundamental, right? This is how we think. This is natural think to people who have a Bill of Rights like we do. Um, and I think we should create dilemmas for the region as well. We should all be speaking out on this. Is he going to allow himself to get pushed out of office? Doubtful.
I'm going to ask one last question and then I'll open it up for all of you. When I introduced Ambassador Story, I said that he was the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela in Bogota, Colombia. And I was wondering if you could just provide a little bit more detail about what it was like being an ambassador essentially in exile.
Well, It's odd. It's odd and off-putting. When we finally left, I'll tell this briefly. There's this thing we have called duty to warn. And when we finally left after 7 weeks of me living in my office on a cot with the Marines and everything, it's because the Maduro regime said to me, the opposition is going to have you murdered to precipitate a war between the United States and Venezuela. So of course I had to tell Secretary Pompeo this, and you may recall Secretary Pompeo was in the House of Representatives. He grilled Secretary Clinton on what happened in Benghazi when our ambassador was killed there. So that gave us about 48 hours to get out. But Secretary Pompeo recognized our need to be as close to the action as possible. So I convinced him to let us open up this embassy in exile across the border, right? And actually, we maintained extraordinary influence inside of Venezuela because Venezuelans could cross the border to see us. I mean, they'd come over for lunch and then go back. And maybe they would spend the night. I mean, it's not easy to get across the border when you're not supposed to leave the country, but we still maintain some influence. And one of the things that I was able to do is every Friday have a meeting with all the other missions. The United States has amazing convocatory power. But to give you an idea, I went from an embassy of 100 Americans and 350 locals to a group of 16 people in this mission in exile. Meanwhile, the Irish ambassador was her and one other person, and they had to cover 5 countries, right? So, I mean, and there were a lot of examples like that. So I had a Friday meeting where I would tell all these other countries what was happening in Venezuela. And even though I wasn't there, I still was kind of there. But, I wanted to be the fox in the hen house. You know what I'm saying? I could do so much more work on the ground. When I was in Venezuela, it would really get the Maduro regime upset when I would meet with fishermen and people from disadvantaged communities. They hated that. I was a baseball player. I coached baseball a little bit in high school. They hated me talking to that community as well, right? Going to soup kitchens and this kind of stuff, because what they're selling is an image of the oligarch U.S. invader. And what they get is a guy who speaks really good Spanish, who's just kind of happy-go-lucky, and it takes away that narrative from them. So I wish I could have been on the ground more. I did go back twice in 2022 to negotiate the release of American hostages. And it may mean that I'll be back here in South Carolina sooner rather than later, because meeting with a dictator didn't make me any friends in the Senate. I can tell you that much right now. So we'll see how this all plays out moving forward.
Thank you so much. I think we can open it up to questions from the audience now.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Daphne Santos. I'm a senior here at the college. And my question to you here today is, one thing that I saw when just looking up names of who ambassadors are representing the United States and Latin America is they don't have that identity of like culture in these countries. Do you believe that if we allow more people who grew up in this culture, and I say this because my dad's Guatemalan and my mom's Salvadorian. I lived in Guatemala for 6 years. Do you believe it would make an impact for the United States with these countries and providing a better relationship?
A good friend of mine, Luis Arriaga, he's from Guatemala. He was the ambassador to Guatemala. Actually created problems for him because he knew so many people in Guatemala. You can only imagine the knocks on the doors, hey, visa issue here, and all these other kinds of things. I think the strength of the State Department is our diversity, and in all of its different ways. The State Department used to be called Male, Pale, and Yale. Well, I'm from Moncks Corner, South Carolina. I got 2 of them, right? I don't have the third one, but I was an outlier. I was the only Southerner in my A100 class. We certainly, I do a lot of recruiting. I get a lot of HBCUs, and I think we look more like America today. We're not where we need to be, but we're going in the right direction, and I'm thankful for that. And everybody brings something new. I don't necessarily think you have to be Latino to go to a Latin country. In fact, I've spent 18 of the last 20 years overseas, and sometimes I have trouble United States because I'm more Latino than anything else anymore. But I think it's so helpful when you have people who represent all these different communities, and when you're making decisions, whether they're ambassador or not, you can have a political advisor or counselor, you can have your economic people, and that just makes such a strong thing. There's something else I want to say, and it's not really apropos your question, but I want to talk about the strength of America with something. I was consul general in Rio. I had 5 people, and this will speak quickly to our baked-in advantages over China, the peak China question we had yesterday. I had 5 American diplomats on my team who all immigrated to the United States after the age of 20. India, Bulgaria, Romania, Guatemala, and Poland. Age 20, after age 20, immigrated to the United States, became citizens, and then a diplomat. Do you think if you are not Han Chinese, you can become a Chinese diplomat? I know the answer to the question. You can't become Chinese. You can't become Japanese, but you can become American.
Hi, I'm Sam Coughlin. I was just wondering, you previously mentioned that you think, in your opinion, we need to start creating dilemmas. I was wondering if you just give 1 or 2 examples of maybe a dilemma that we could create per se.
Dilemma, yeah. No, I think some of the dilemmas are getting some votes in some of the multilateral fora. Again, specifically on the Maduro question, right? Yeah, I think that's a dilemma. We're gonna, the way we set up the sanctions relief, those sanctions are gonna snap back automatically in April, which will create another set of dilemmas. I think we should take this up with the UN Human Rights Commission, create another dilemma. I think we should name and shame much more. Frankly, y'all can Google this, if y'all want to have a laugh at my Spanish, maybe, but I used to have an internet television program called Allo Embajador, Hello Ambassador. It was kind of a riff on Allo Presidente, Hugo Chavez's program back in the day. And I can't believe the State Department let me do this, by the way, y'all. They weren't paying attention. I can tell you that much right now. Like I would just say whatever came to my mind and take questions from the audience for 30 minutes once a week. I started it during the pandemic. And I was way out of left field. Yeah, I'm really surprised I didn't get fired. But anyway, I would just kind of riff, right? And Facebook changed its algorithm, and I could no longer, once I became ambassador, they said, oh, you're a political figure. You can't pay to increase your posts or advertise your posting. So then we had to switch to Twitter and had problems there. And, and I was getting like 300,000 views a week. So it was not a small thing. And suddenly I'm getting 40, 50,000. Meanwhile, Maduro has a Twitter account. It filled with bots, thousands and thousands of bots. Putin's got a Twitter account. Navalny's widow's Twitter account was suspended momentarily, right? Just this week, as a matter of fact. I'm like, we're allowing we're allowing Autocracy Inc. to use our tools against us. So I think we should create a dilemma there for them as well. And I'm all about free speech. Again, I know who Marjorie Taylor Greene is. I can't help but watch her Twitter account because there's crazy stuff going on there, right? And to be very bipartisan, there's some crazy stuff coming out of the AOC account too. Like I can't, George Santos, that's even better. This is like watching a train wreck. But having said that, I'm a free speech guy, but really, we're going to allow them to go after Democratic actors and undermine them and attack them. There's a limit to free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. So that's another dilemma I'd like to see us do. Of course, I'm sure I'm going to get sanctioned by ACLU or something for having said that. But we got to figure out a way to undermine their ability to use some of those tools against us as well.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Your kind of outline of variety of threats, I guess, that the U.S. has to deal with is poses too many questions. One that I would like to pursue a little bit more is on the migration crisis. And obviously, a lot of the migrants that are coming on the southern border are escaping all kinds of things, right? Some of them are not even from Latin America. So clearly, the Senate and the House are not able to resolve the immigration problem. So what can the State Department do to reduce the reasons for immigration? And you say that often people are escaping lack of freedoms, but also it's violence and economic lack of opportunities and all these things. And so as a diplomat, and what can we do to resolve the issues that the Congress is not going to resolve?
Yeah, when I ran the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement for the Western Hemisphere, after doing that in Colombia, we did something called the Place-Based Initiative in Central America and the Northern Triangle. And basically it was, how do you improve people's access to government in a good way? How do you improve their security? How do you give them kind of buy-in into society? And we're doing it again with a new program called the Place-Based Initiative. It's the exact same thing we were doing 10 years ago, but now it's new. And I think we can do that. But one of my students has done some really interesting regression analysis, which I only know the words. I don't know what it really means. But he's looking at the case of El Salvador, and actually, as security has increased, migration has improved. Migration has increased, which is not what you'd expect. And I believe that our thinking that if we just fix the economy in Venezuela by lifting sanctions, that'll keep people from migrating. And I think that's wrong as well. I mean, so we can do programs, again, Democrat, middle class, secure. We can do these programs and give people some hope, but we have to fix the problem at the border. Frankly, the border became, or migration issues were exacerbated by how hard it is across the border. We had the Bracero program from Mexico up into the 1950s, where people would come 6 months and go back 6 months. Countries in the Middle East do this. Canada does this very well with unlimited numbers of H-2 visas, where people can go and work and go home. We have to consider the cost of capital, your access to capital in Central America, for instance. Can you get a loan? Right? All of these things kind of mix in together before you even get to the border. But we have to fix that too. We have to fix our asylum process. We have to, we're going to have to legislate this thing. It can't be an executive order. And I was pretty disappointed that we couldn't get something done, especially when it was tied to the Ukraine situation, which is an own goal, if I can soccer speak, of massive proportions. So I think we should do those types of programs, but we got to get some legislation working too.
John Bagui, thank you very much for the enlightening conversation. A question on Venezuela. I'm curious on your perspectives of the status of the oil industry and its influence, either positively or either stabilizing or destabilizing in terms of the region, especially with the recent discoveries and things like that.
The Venezuelan oil industry. So the United States produces more oil today than any country in the history of the world, 13 million barrels a day. We consume 20 million barrels a day. Venezuela produces 750,000 barrels a day, of which the only oil we can actually take is from Chevron, because we're not going to take Iranian, Chinese, or Russian produced oil, right? So if you just do the math, it doesn't change the needle, right? That oil. But let's think bigger. There's a reason why the United States is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in the world. It's because capital is a coward. Money goes where it gets a 5% return on investment. Money doesn't go where it could get lost. And what's happened in Venezuela is expropriations of oil industry, expropriate Kellogg's. They still got Frosted Flakes down there, but Kellogg's is not making them. Somebody else is making them at a Kellogg's facility. I know I talked to the Kellogg's people. And so you have billions upon billions upon billions of dollars of outstanding claims against the Venezuelan state. And I can't imagine a world in which a board of directors of any country would say, yeah, let's sink another 30 billion in there, right? Ain't gonna happen. So when we lifted the sanctions, nothing happened. Nobody showed up with pockets of, suitcases full of cash. And it's not going to happen because nobody trusts a system where rule of law is not extant and sanctity of contracts doesn't exist. So you get to a situation in which without the restoration of the political system and democracy, you're not going to see that industry come back at all. I mean, that's my take on it. But I mean, it is supported by data. The Russians have been there, the Chinese have been there. Have they increased production? No. No, it's actually against Russia's interest because they're selling their oil to China, taking away market share from Venezuela. Right? So I don't think the oil industry, I think the oil industry in Venezuela is cooked until we fix the political situation.
Hello. You mentioned earlier in your talk that we make bad policy if we approach it like we're the only game in town. So how do you suggest we approach public policy in the age of the rise of the rest?
I mean, there's got to be a little humility, right? And it's about partnership and it's a recognition that people have options. I can give you examples. Yeah, President Modi of India has a state visit. He's with the president at the White House, jumps on an airplane at the end of it and flies to Beijing. President Petro of Colombia is in Beijing, leaves it, flies to Washington. It's just a recognition that countries have options. We need to provide more options too. We bemoan the fact that all the Chinese companies win all these tenders to build infrastructure. Well, guess what? We don't do infrastructure projects in the United States. We bemoan the fact that Huawei has a 5G network and everybody's buying it and it's going to give backdoors into people's data. Well, guess what? We don't have a 5G network that we can offer. So we have to offer better options to these countries. And we have to also recognize that sometimes they're going to go their own direction. That doesn't mean the end. It doesn't have to be that binary choice of East versus West like we had in the Cold War. Or as Bush put it during the global war on terror, either with us or you're against us, right? Now you can be with us you could seek a free trade agreement in the United States and be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, people have options, and I think our recognition of those options means that we will come up with better policy prescriptions to deal with those countries.
We do have time for one more question.
My name's Cadence, and your mention of how those in Sao Paulo kind of laughed at the 2008 recession and, the upcoming Venezuela elections, we have in the United States have had our own issues kind of agreeing on what constitutes a fair and free election. It's been kind of embarrassing, but I am wondering what your take on and how we get other countries to take us seriously when we want to tout fair and free elections to other countries and what that plan is.
Well, you put your finger on it, huh? I mean, listen, people ask me, what's it like to be a diplomat? I'm like, well, it depends on who's in the White House sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's a little easier than others. Sometimes I tell you, it was so easy with Barack Obama because I was in Brazil at the time for part of his time in office, and it was such an extraordinarily easy sell for the Brazilian people. They consider themselves post-racial, which are not. It's a racist society. I'll say that. I mean, they got their own racial problems, but it opened some doors that hadn't been opened before, right? But yeah, we've got to get things together, and there shouldn't be a litmus test on, oh my gosh, you did a bipartisan agreement, or look at the senator from Oklahoma, Langford, I think his name is. He was doing the deal and he got censored by the Republican Party because he came up with a bipartisan border deal that 2/3 of the Senate agreed on, and suddenly he finds himself getting sanctioned for it. That's kind of a weird thing. Or look at senators on the other side of the aisle. I'm just being careful here. Who have corruption charges against them, yet they haven't been removed from the Senate, right? I mean, there are problems on both sides. I'm trying to be as down the road as it possibly can be. I think what we need to be selling, though, is not just election and election integrity. We need to sell the Bill of Rights. We need to sell the foundational arguments of what makes America what America is. Investigative journalism, I love that stuff, right? We need to, your ability to say whatever you want to say, even though I think some people need to be off of Twitter because of what they say, right? But the fact that you have the right to of assembly and the right of your own religion and all of these kinds of rights that fundamentally speak to one big word, liberty, sell that. And we don't have to sell, well, we use this, voting system here and that voting system there. And yeah, because a lot of countries look at us and are like, well, you're not very democratic. You're the person who wins the majority of votes, not president, because you have this electoral system. I've gone back and forth on that in my own head from undergrad to grad school to today. Some days I feel one way, some days I feel another. But I think we don't have to sell. I think there's plenty of positive things we can sell.
Ambassador Story and Dean Arias, thank you so much for this discussion, for the Q&A session, and thank you all for joining us. We'll take a short break and then we'll resume in about 7 minutes.